I'm going to speak today about, first of all, I titled what I'm about to speak, Holocaust Averted. This year, 2018, marks the 75th anniversary of the heroic rescue of nearly 50,000 Bulgarian Jews during World War II, the result of colossal efforts initiated by the Bulgarian Parliament, the King, the Bulgarian Orthodox Church, and the entire populace. And with all the intrigues and machinations, the story of how it came about is the stuff from which movies are made. Political maneuverings, betrayal, intrigue, murder, mysterious death. Truly an instance where truth and reality are events. My cousin, who is a retired police officer and a historian of military history, was quite shocked because he had not heard about it. Now, and history has bestowed on the Bulgarian people a unique attitude, a mode of behavior and outlook. Unlike Bulgaria's Balkan neighbors, who are fiercely nationalistic, chauvinistic, proud, like the Serbs, the Romanians, the Croatians, the Greeks, Bulgarians are patriotic, but not at all nationalistic. They were, a few years ago, voted the most skeptical people in Europe. And they are skeptical, they are cynical, they complain, they are stubborn. And if the expression herding cats can be applied, it is to Bulgarians. And this is one of the things that made this, what they did, work. And perhaps the most important thing about the Bulgarian population was tolerance of all ethnicities and religions. The Jews of Bulgaria, mostly Sephardic, as I mentioned, whose community actually dates back to the 15th century, when they were expelled from Spain, were fully integrated into the society. They belonged to the working class and were fully part of society, and everyone was in the same economic boat, poor. So how was it possible for a fascist government, which it was at the time, a state-supported church and the majority Christian population of Bulgaria, to defy the Nazis in a way comparable in all of Europe only to Denmark, and even more so? Certainly the countries surrounding Bulgaria proved themselves to be all too willing to engage in the virulent anti-Semitism for which Nazi Germany proved so able a leader. So it might have been because, through habits formed during the Ottoman times, Bulgarian Jews were, as I've said, thoroughly integrated into society. They were your neighbors, they were your friends, they were people you just walked into in the street. But on the other hand, Germany itself had one of the most assimilated Jewish populations in Europe. So what is the difference here? Anyway, a little bit of historical background. From 1939 to 41, that is the outset of World War II, the Kingdom of Bulgaria, and it was a kingdom, it had a king, declared a position of neutrality following the outbreak of the war. But from 1941 to 44, she joined the Axis of Power and became an ally of Nazi Germany, and officially embraced Hitler's policies of anti-Semitism. Indeed, Bulgarian Jews were forced to wear the yellow star. However, when the Bulgarian government began steps to implement the law for protection of the nation, very much modeled on the Nuremberg laws that were implemented in Germany a little before that, which was effective from the 23rd of January 1941 to 27th of November 44, letters of protest against the preparation of this law with its harsh measures toward the country's Jewish minority came from every quarter, from the Jewish leaders, writers, doctors, lawyers, the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences, the Bulgarian Orthodox Church, and even bakers, particularly pastry chefs. One letter read, "This is not a law for the nation's defense, but rather a proposal for its infamy." So, what was this law? Okay, the law ordered measures for changes in the names of the Jews. You had to drop the off. Rules about, or add the off, was it? Rules about their place of residence. Confiscation of their possessions. Horrible. Their expulsion from public service. Prohibition of economic and professional activity. Citizens of Jewish origin were also banned from certain public areas. Sounds like the United States during the 1930s. restricted economically, and marriages between Jews and Bulgarians were prohibited. Jews were forced to pay a one-time tax of 20% of their net worth. The legislation also established quotas that limited the number of Jews in Bulgarian universities. Jewish leaders protested against the law, as did everybody else at this time. Everybody was against it. And by the way, the law suppressed all Freemasonry lodges and all other secret organizations. What were the Freemasons doing? I don't know. The law was passed under direct influence from Nazi Germany, but did not lead to the deportation of the Bulgarian Jews to Nazi extermination camps, except for the Jewish people from former Greek and Yugoslav territories that were occupied Bulgaria at the time, and I will raise this later on. The society's displeasure has been well documented in the Bulgarian language. All chimed in saying that the proposed actions were against the Bulgarian constitution, a document that was sacrosanct to the Bulgarian people, that had been created and implemented after 1876, which guaranteed the freedom of everyone born in the country. And everybody held up the Constitution and said, how dare you try this? Bulgaria was still a democracy for a short time, where the working parliament, even though it had a king, and everyone wanted to defend the country's freedom. There were heated debates in parliament, but the law passed anyways, to everyone's outrage. And archival documentation of all events have for the first time become fully available. By the way, this is one of the archival documents that we managed to pull up. It says ukaz from Tsar Boris III. An ukaz is an edict, meaning that it's been signed into law. So what happened? How did the next nefarious step begin? How was it sabotaged? And sabotage is the best word for it. And I cannot overemphasize the concerted effect unique to Bulgaria by a diverse collection of figures who are virtually unknown to the West. And who were they, and what was their role? First of all, King Boris III. By the way, Bulgaria is so strange in this way that his son, Simeon Saxe-Coburg, who grew up in exile along with his sister, he grew up in Spain, she grew up in Canada and the US, returned to Bulgaria in the early 2000s and became the country's prime minister. Made a mess of things and left again. Let's say go figure. Anyway, like all the royal households, the royal blue bloods in Europe, he was of German descent, probably traceable back to Queen Victoria family, and was himself personally not anti-Semitic, and seemed to have spent a good deal of time dodging German demands and deportations. He was summoned to the Wolf's Lair with Mr. Hitler, and the first meetings were cordial and jolly, and the last time Hitler lost it. Joseph Goebbels, the little weasel who was in charge of Hitler's propaganda, wrote in his diary that Boris was cunning like a fox. He was. Cunning Boris was entirely willing to deport to the death camps the entire Jewish population of Thrace and Macedonia, which were under Bulgarian control. But he drew the line at his Jews, hedging that they were needed for road maintenance. Sadly, as I will mention, discuss in a little more detail, that because Bulgaria was an ally of Nazi Germany, it was given territories that part of Greece, known as Thrace, and Macedonia, which is itself a former Yugoslav republic, and Bulgaria did not succeed in saving those Jews. 11,000 of them were deported to Treblinka and Auschwitz and all perished. So this is the story does not have an entirely happy ending. Anyway, here's Hitler and Tsar Boris on the left here. And there they are shaking hands in uniform. The next figure on our list of interesting characters was the Bulgarian Prime Minister, a fellow by the name of Bogdan Filov. On the 15th of February 1940, Filov was appointed Prime Minister of the Kingdom of Bulgaria. and Filov was a close ally to the Bulgarian king. On 14th of February the following year, Bulgaria signed a non-aggression pact with the Axis of Power, and on March the 1st joined the Tripartite Act. On Bulgaria's Independence Day, March the 3rd, German troops crossed into Bulgaria on the way to invade Yugoslavia and Greece when all this change of border took place. And it was Filov's government that signed the law for protection of the nation. Now, Filov was known for his anti-Semitism. There he is with the little Schippergruber there on the right. Well, actually, yeah, Filov is right. Now, he doesn't have a nice end. In 1945, communists, Bulgaria had switched alliances by this time and aligned themselves with the Soviet Union. And Andy, you can't correct me if my dates are wrong here. Bulgaria came under communism, and one of the most obscene things in history happened, regardless of what Filov was like personally. The communists sentenced him to death, and he was executed along with the entire 92 members of the Bulgarian parliament and buried in a mass grave. So Bulgaria has not had an easy time of it, that's for sure. Next person in this little drama is a fellow by the name of Alexander Belov. And he was the Bulgarian Commissar of Jewish Affairs during World War II. Famous with his anti-Semitic and strongly nationalistic views. He played a central role in the deportation of some of the 12,000 Jews to Nazi concentration camps in occupied Poland. Because of the public outrage Belov encountered from the populace, he was ultimately forced to abandon the plans altogether when ordered to do so in a telephone call from the king. In 1953, Belov was 43 was dismissed from his position as commissar, but he disappeared in September 1944. He was captured and arrested by partisans who were themselves communists, and one Jewish communist shot him and dumped his body in a ditch where it lay to decompose. Yeah, he was commissar of Jewish affairs. Now, what does the secretary got to do with all this? Liliana Panica. She was Belov's secretary and lover. When Adolf Eichmann's deputy, Theodor Daniker, came to Bulgaria to deport the Jews, the young secretary, betraying her lover's confidence, discovered the secret agreements between her employer and the German envoy, and hurried to inform the Jewish and Bulgarian leaders of the forthcoming deportation, thereby disrupting the whole chain of events. The news was the catalyst of that unprecedented event that led by all parties involved, including Bulgaria's fascists, to prevent the deportation from happening. What's very strange about Bulgarian parliament, it was full of fascists, and they all signed a document saying not to deport the Jews. You want to say, what? She would later also be arrested and tortured by the communists, and she never fully recovered from her torture and died shortly thereafter. Pillow talk. That's how it happens. Now, here's probably the most important figure of this little narrative here. The authoritative intervention of the church came on top of the decisive initiative of the deputy parliament president and parliamentary speaker Dmitry Peshev, who first obtained the suspension of trains leaving for Auschwitz, and then, with a letter of protest signed by 42 deputies, including the fascists, the definitive cancellation of the deportation plans altogether. Bulgaria's 48,000 Jews were safe. Only those of Thrace and Macedonia, under the iron grip of the Nazis, were not able to escape the tragic fate of the Holocaust. On March the 26th of 1943, Peshev was fired from his position in Parliament. He was later tried by the communists, initially sentenced to death. He was successfully defended by Jewish lawyers, but was imprisoned for 15 years. He died in obscurity in 1973. was posthumously made an honorary citizen of Israel. And his statement here is rather precious. For some reason, I see. Oops, sorry. Let me let me go back there. Okay, let's go back. My human conscience and my understanding of the faithful consequences, both for the people involved and the policy of the country now and in the future, did not allow me to remain idle. And I decided to do all in my power to prevent what was being planned from happening. I knew that this action was going to shame Bulgaria in the eyes of the world and brand her with a stain she didn't deserve. Now, here's where it gets. Here's another public protest. A picture taken in 1943 in front of the St. Alexander Nevsky Cathedral in Sofia, which is one of the largest churches in the Balkans. Peshev and a group of people rallying to prevent the deportation. It's a little hard to see. It's got an old black and white photograph there, as it is. Now, the loudest and most disruptive protests came from the church metropolitans Stefan and Kirill and the Holy Synod of the entire Bulgarian Orthodox Church. Well, there he is, Stefan. As a whole, history has taught us the Orthodox Church does not have a good track record when it comes to its relationship with the Jews. The exception being the Bulgarian Church. For example, as a puppet of whatever the ruling regime, Tsarist, Soviet, or Vladimir Putin, the Russian Orthodox Church has a long history of strident and even malignant anti-Semitism. And lately, reading some very troubling news from the New York Times that among the prelates of the Russian Orthodox Church, they're bringing back the myth of blood libel, blaming the Jews for the murder of the Tsar, which is obscene. The Bulgarian Orthodox Church has nothing of the sort, nor does Bulgaria as a whole. It was never until likely communist times did it ever have any real, did the government have ever have any real sway over the policies of the church. Though, of course, this was typical of the Bulgarians. The then head of the Bulgarian Church, Metropolitan Stefan, was one of Sofia's most eminent and controversial figures. When World War II broke out, Stefan became the declared enemy of the Third Reich. Quote, "Only madmen," he wrote in his diary, "can fall under the hysteria that has taken over this miserable Führer. What has happened to the great German civilization if the people allow themselves to be commanded by a crazed Führer? Is this culture not a deceptive facade of the barbarian fury of the Teutonic race?" A little bit of anti-German sentiment there. Stefan lost no opportunity to express his criticism in articles that were frequently censored and led to alarming threats on the part of the fascists and the Nazis. Arguing with the censor, he said, "It's not true that I'm an anti-German. I greatly admire numerous Germans, such as Stefan Zweig, Thomas Mann, and Albert Wassermann," deliberately selecting the names of illustrious German Jews. In September 1942, he infuriated fascist and Nazi circles by openly preaching against anti-Semitism. He publicly declared that Bulgaria should consider the Jews as their brothers. In 1943, as German anti-Semitism took hold all over Europe, Stefan worked to engage the whole Bulgarian church in his opposition to Nazi policies and effectively gained the compact backing of both the church hierarchy and the believers, who supported him wholeheartedly. Plovdiv's Metropolitan Kirill and Vidin's Venerable Neophyte, president of the Holy Synod, also strongly opposed the repressive measures adopted against the Jews. All the top-ranking prelates signed a formal protest to the king, also threatening to excommunicate him if he continued to approve of the Nazis' cruel methods. And it says here, Stefan threatening the king, "If the persecution of the Jews continues, I shall open the doors of all Bulgarian churches to them, and then we shall see who can drive them out." So, on April 2nd, of 1943, the leaders of the Holy Synod of the Bulgarian Church met in Sofia to discuss the government's pro-Nazi policies. Vidin, this is a small town in the northwestern part of Bulgaria, on the Danube River. Their Metropolitan Neophyte, who opened the proceedings, went straight to the point. "The Jews know only too well that nobody is speaking out authoritatively in their defense, but the voice of the Bulgarian Church can also speak much louder, will be heard, and if the Church does not intervene to defend these helpless wretches, then we can only expect more cruelty, for which our good-hearted people one day feel ashamed, and for which they may even suffer further ruin." The debate continued, and Stefan then wound it up with these words: "When we ask the state authorities what the Jews of this country are guilty of, they have nothing to say. They take everything from the Jews, but when they try to take their lives, the Jews ask the Church to defend them. We cannot refuse. They are being subjected to inhuman suffering." Finally, some Christian behavior from a Christian church. Wow. The hierarchy of the entire Synod were signatories in the protest, and we looked at the document with all their signatures, which is a download from the Bulgarian archives. And the Bulgarian Church also organized the members to protect the Jewish houses when the Jews were detained. Even more outrageous in his reactions was Metropolitan Kirill. This guy's a real character. Who threatened to begin a campaign of civil disobedience by lying on the railroad tracks in front of the deportation trains. Now, Kirill also, backed by a mob, the Jews had been rounded up in Plovdiv and were kept in the schoolyard behind a fence with German armed guards. And Kirill, fully vested, pushed them aside. He was a big man, climbed the fence, over the fence, and jumped down and stood among them and said, "Come and get him." Now, it was a good thing that the two German guards backed away, because had anything bad happened to him, their fates would not have been so good. He would later become the patriarch of the Bulgarian Church, and a position he held until his death in 1971. And as a second personal note, Kirill was a close personal friend of Plovdiv's chief rabbi, one Shmuel Bechar, whose daughter, as it turns out, Shoshana, has been a long-time personal friend. And when I was staying with Shoshana in Plovdiv a number of years ago, she showed me a photograph of her father saying in Bulgarian, "Tvoj beshe vladika." He was head rabbi. And when I was reading this, it just jumped off the page at me. It's a holy smoke. I know this person. She's likely passed away. She was of great age. Anyways. Okay. When Kirill went among the Jews, he said, "Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God," from the book of Ruth. Another figure, and here's a picture of Dmitry Peshev and Rabbi Daniel Tzion. In May 1943, a longtime chief rabbi, Dr. Asher Hananel, he helped prevent 800 Soviet Jews from being handed over to the Nazis and deported to the extermination camps. He did so by appealing to Metropolitan Stefan, who then appealed to the Tsar. So you see how everything's working here, and not working for the Germans. On May 24, 1943, Rabbi Tzion, addressing a gathering at a synagogue, this is so he addressed this gathering at the synagogue, and he then participated in a mass street demonstration against the anti-Jewish law for the protection of the nation. The law was as it turns out, Bishop Stefan gave him refuge from the Nazis. He was pursued, but however, on May 26, 1943, he and many other demonstrators were arrested by the police. He was then sent to a concentration camp for Jews in a little town of Samovit on the banks of Danube, which I believe is near the town not far from Vidin Rusa in the north there. On September 9th, 1944, he was appointed as one of Sofia's senior rabbis. But in 1949, he emigrated to Jaffa, Israel, where he lived until his death in 1976-79, we're not sure. Now, what happened afterwards? Let's see what we got here. Oh yeah, this guy. Boris died suddenly in September 1943, and his death remains shrouded in mystery. But his death stopped the deportation deportation attempts. There had been 3 attempts to deport the Jews, but his death stopped it all once and for all. The Nazis gave up on the Bulgarians. It seems that Bulgarian subterfuge and deliberate obfuscation sabotaged the Nazis' plan to deport the Jews. And they just didn't get it. German Ambassador Adolf Heinz Beckerle, which you see here, wrote in 1943, Bulgarian society doesn't understand the real meaning of the Jewish question. The average Bulgarian doesn't understand the meaning of the struggle against the Jews, the more so as the racial question is totally foreign to them. And I am convinced that the Prime Minister and the entire cabinet desire and aspire to a final solution of the Jewish question. But they are tied by the mentality of the Bulgarian people that lacks the ideological enlightenment that we have. Right. Okay. Okay. Okay, and by the way, here's a picture of the Boris was given 2 options, either to deport the Jews to the camps, to Treblinka, to Auschwitz, or to send them out of town. And as my father-in-law was among them, Jews were, I would say, expelled from the big cities like Sofia, like Plovdiv, and sent to the smaller towns where they were forced to do manual labor, digging roads. Some of them were badly treated. True, others were not. There's one story where one was able to leave for the weekend to attend a wedding. My father-in-law, who I unfortunately only met once, did return, and he was forced to do manual labor, yes, but it was far better than the alternative. The story does not end happily for the key players of Bulgaria, as you've heard what happened to their fates, nor should there be any attempt to whitewashing the events in favor of Bulgaria concerning those Jews from Thrace and Macedonia. As mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, Bulgarian Jews did suffer hardships, in particular the forced labor, which was the lesser of the two evils. And what could have ended a lot better for Bulgaria, and as I've already inferred, 1944, with the backing of the Soviet military, Bulgaria switched sides, and since that time came under communist rule. The Soviets turned out to be even worse because, first of all, the Soviet Union wanted to claim credit for saving the Jews, and which is really pissed off the Bulgarians, saying, "How dare you?" And the whole Jewish rescue was kept secret by the Soviet Union, which would later try to take credit for this rescue because the Bulgarian government, the Bulgarian king, and the church took actions that contributed to the huge public outcry and calls from the people to defend their Jewish friends and neighbors. And the communist Soviet regime could not countenance credit to be given to the former authorities, the church, the king, and all three were considered enemies of communism. Now, the end of communism, things don't get too much better. Well, it does, of course, which took place in 1989 when they removed the last of the communist dictators, Todor Zhivkov. The consequence of that is given rise to a great deal of political pluralism, and once again the appearance of parties with extreme right-wing agendas, including those who downplay the events that took place during these years, and even downright Holocaust denial. The extreme right-wing party known as Ataka, for example, says it didn't happen, and Bulgarians sent him to Israel. I think they straightened him out, if that's possible. And also, of late, there are those who are writing that it was not as big a deal as was made. In fact, we even encountered this ourselves when visiting the Bulgarian consulate in Manhattan a few years ago, when there was rumors circulating that, word was circulating that it wasn't such a big deal after all. Now, to answer a question posed at the beginning of my presentation, asking why haven't we known about these events? Why didn't we know about these answers? And the documentation proving the saving of Bulgarian Jews only came to light after the end of the Cold War in 1989. And the number of 48,000, the exact number is 48,398, which has risen to over 52,000 Bulgarian Jews. That number was actually known to Hitler. Yet not one was deported or murdered by the Nazis. So where are we now? The bitter fact remains the Jews in Bulgarian-administered territories of Thrace and Macedonia, given to the Germans, did perish in Treblinka. And how did this happen? How was it happens? There's no single answer. Nobody was ever punished for it, for the deportation of these Jews. And we can't only attribute Boris's weakness, and he was a weak man. He was a weak man. It cannot be offered as an excuse anyway. And at the end of World War II, over 90% of Bulgarian Jews emigrated to the newly founded state of Israel. Today, less than 5,000, even no more than 2,000 remains in Bulgaria. But regardless of whatever the criticism, what Bulgaria did during World War II was on a scale that did not happen anywhere else in the world at any time. So as a postscript, what happens? Peshev. 3 monuments here. Peshev, Kirill, and Stefan were later formally honored by Israel as righteous among the nations. In 2013, a street intersection outside the Bulgarian embassy in Washington, D.C. was named Dmitry Peshev Plaza. On March 10th, 2016, the 73rd anniversary of the rescue was officially commemorated in Bulgaria as Holocaust Memorial Day. And each year on March 9th and 10th, Jewish communities say Kaddish for Stefan and Kirill. On October the 3rd, 2013, upon invitation of the Club of Friends, Bulgarian Jews, Boris' son, Simeon Sachs-Coburg, attended the service marking the 72nd anniversary of the stop of the deportation, which took place in front of the commemorative plaques of Salvation of Bulgarian Jews in World War II Memorial next to St. Sophia Church, which is beside the big central cathedral. Wreaths were laid in commemoration of the rescuers of the Jews in 1943, as well as memory of the Jews from the Aegean and Vardar, Macedonia, deported by Nazi Germany. They gathered to pay their respect to the memory of Boris III, to the hierarchs, to Peshev and other Bulgarian intellectuals. And the co-chairman of the Israel-Bulgaria Institute laid a wreath of appreciation, followed by a prayer of gratitude in Hebrew. And most recently, on March 31st, 2017, the head of the Bulgarian Church, currently Patriarch Neophyt, held talks with Moshe Aloni, one of the initiators of the nomination of the Church for a Nobel Peace Prize for the role in preventing the deportation of the Jews in 1943. Who saved them? In the end, who did? The Bulgarian body politic. So to sum up, Bulgarian civil society, everybody chipped in. The Bulgarian parliament, the Bulgarian church and other religious communities, the lack of destructive anti-Semitism among Bulgarian people and the full integration of the Jews into the society, King Boris III of Bulgaria, the military advances of the Allies in 1943, Hashem, God. It is Metropolitan Stefan who has the last word here, who writes in his last will and testament that best sums it all up. What a moral disaster was the insane anti-Jewish action. What a mental derangement of the fascist mafia, the appointed parliament, and of the indifference of the society who, in order to please Hitler, denied our people the sublime feeling of defending the oppressed, the persecuted minorities, of their peaceful and innocent Bulgarians of foreign origins. Still today, I recall with pain the persecution of the Jews. So what Bulgaria did collectively should have served as a model for everyone everywhere else at this time. Thank you.
Any questions? Any questions?
Any questions?
Thank you.
The Jews that were, were forced to do hard labor, was it the men? The women were left in their homes?
As far as I know, it was
Yes.
the men. It was
I
the
can
men.
answer questions.
Yes, she's actually better at it.
It is important. I wanted to clarify a few things that by reading all the documents from the archives, and this is the only thing I actually believe, is certain things I clear for myself that you didn't mention yet. Bulgaria was 500 years under Ottoman Empire. When we say that all the Jews were integrated or all Bulgarians didn't have anti-Semitic feelings, that people will say, oh, what do you mean? Everybody has everywhere. But this was society 500 years living together, everybody with everybody else. There are Armenians, Gypsies, they say Tatars, everybody. It is Byzantine Empire. This is to explain why there was not anti-Semitism. But second thing, I realized, because of my own history, when Bulgaria finally was granted from the great forces, 1878, finally Bulgaria became country independent. So after Russian Empire, British, France, everybody. So that was the time. Imagine after 500 years, you have your own country. Constitution that was created from all my life. I knew this is called Ternov Constitution. Ternov is the second Bulgarian kingdom where everybody was gathered after Bulgaria got granted independence. And Ternov Constitution was the most holy document for every Bulgarian. And this was the document when was going on later on, 50 years later, in the parliament. One of those intellectuals and members of parliament telling the king and everybody else, you're touching our constitution, this is the holy thing. And I was reading this, is really to cry almost, to say, your grandfather signed up with blood this constitution of what I told him to quote. Every person who lives in Bulgaria is Bulgarian citizen, and every Bulgarian citizen has equal rights. You can't touch these people. And so it was, I believe this was one big help in to tell them, like, sorry guys, you can't touch it. That's it. But it was interesting for me to discover all this, the way they were fighting. And the other thing, every possible organizations, the lawyer were arguing, you read the documents about constitutional rights in reading. Stefan was just incredible in Plovdiv what they were doing. And Panitsa, the secretary, what she did was the most incredible, because the whole deportation that was planned, the first attempt on March 9th, nobody knew about. Nobody knew. If she didn't tell them, and she alerted Peshev, who was in parliament working, they would have been deported, I believe.
It was like pillow talk.
Pillow talk, exactly, yeah. Because
Pillow talk,
Yes.
yes.
Labeled it pillow talk, yeah.
And it was incredible that she actually warned them, and people were, when he said in Plovdiv, they were already gathered. You can look on YouTube. People were gathered. That's it, you're going. They were already in the school, and people were screaming, and they knew where they are taken. But then Peshev came with all these documents after he signed up with the king that you can't deport it. It wasn't voted in a parliament. So all this combination of Bulgaria being parliamentarian country that you have no right to do it. You need signature of whatever number of deputies. And they didn't have them, so they had to cancel.
How many Nazis, did Germany send a lot of Nazis into Bulgaria? Were there a lot of soldiers
there was a
there?
very strong German presence, and
We were allied, but
henchman was Dannecker, who was the
the other
Eichmann's
thing
right-hand
people
man.
don't understand, when we read books about Boris, yes, he was actually a biologist, he loves his science, and just this word was totally for him so difficult to deal. But it is the way the whole thing was going with Germans was totally unbearable for him, and that's why he was like a fox on everything.
Cutting like a rock.
The Constitution to me was really one thing that was important to use for me to understand. I just couldn't understand how did that happen. And all these civil societies, there are documents from citizens, like, how dare you touching our constitution? And all of this were going on to the parliament. But of course, the biggest person who deserved the most is Peshev, who we didn't know. And communists hid it from us. We didn't know anything about. And so the last third, you call it wasn't really third deportation, but the third attempt, Hitler told him, like, you have two choices. Either Treblinka or somewhere you have to send them. And so they make it this type of labor that my grandmother told me that they were taken out from Sofia. They were ordered to leave.
What I find interesting is that Hitler was trying to gather also land. I mean, they were trying to overtake places, and it doesn't seem that, I don't know whether I just don't know enough, but it doesn't feel that way. You know, it isn't many countries whose people did stand up and say, you know, no. And find a way to stop
Bulgaria, I mean, Hitler valued Bulgaria as an ally. And when Bulgaria found that, you know, it's not working out, they switched sides.
But this was when already Allied forces were crossing towards Bulgaria. In 1943, he was really losing big battles against Russia, so pictures started getting very clear that there is no point even. But
so why didn't Hitler come in with his army and just take Bulgaria over like he did?
But why would he?
They were allies. They were friends.
They were allies.
They were friends, yeah.
He was
Whereas
actually
France and Poland weren't allies.
Right, and he had overrun Greece. He had overrun
no,
the neighbors.
He was allied with Bulgaria.
Allies, so
but the other thing that actually King Boris succeeded to fight against Hitler, being his ally.
Right.
Hitler wanted Boris to send Bulgarian soldiers to fight against Russia, and he said, we can't do that. So he said there wasn't one Bulgarian going, because they said these two countries have very strong ties from history.
But he really was between a rock and a hard place there, and it had to
what I was
play
going
very
to say,
diplomatic game.
Boris had only two choices, either Hitler or Stalin. And while the world didn't know enough about Stalin, at that time in Bulgaria, they knew. So he had to choose. I mean, it's a small country. He tried to be neutral for some time, but of course Hitler needed to pass armies through Bulgaria. So he said instead to be with Stalin, which was much more devastated for a German blue blood, after killing all the Russian family, king family. I mean, how can you choose the Bolsheviks? It's like. But I'm not, of course, justifying, but that was the normal part of the war at that time.
So why, in effect, when we, hear about Holocaust education and, sessions on Holocaust, how come we don't know about the Bulgarian Jews?
This is what Greg tried to explain, that I didn't know anything. I just remember my grandmother telling me stories how harsh life was for the Jews, that her son, my uncle, was beaten almost to death, and it was all anti-Jewish. My mom was believing in the communist idea and fairness of the whole world. My dad was totally against communism. And I asked, Mom, who saved the Jews? All communists. My dad said, nonsense. The intelligentsia of Bulgaria did, but we didn't have access. It wasn't
only after 1989 that the truth came out.
Really?
The Soviets kept a lid on history.
Really, the greatest power in Bulgaria always was the church. Because during 500 years, Ottoman Empire, church was the home. Our church is quite different of Russian. I live in Russia for 5 years. In Bulgarian church, you go, it's like home. There is not this kind of gold and things. So Bulgarian church for 5 centuries was educational. It was
preserved the culture.
And it was very powerful thing when those two Metropolitan Stefan and Kirill were like imagine Metropolitan is threatening the king to excommunicate him. It's like,
No,
when does that happen?
that really seems
They were,
to have been in addition to
I mean,
it seems to have
it
been a
was
very
very powerful. So
part of
communists came to
Yes.
Russia first. What did they do? They killed
Yes.
every one of their priests. So Bulgaria was, they knew that church is very strong. 1944, in September, when Russian forces and the whole Allied crossed the borders of Bulgaria, they took over the country. Of course they'll shut the church to say anything. They would never acknowledge that church actually did huge amount.
Right. Well, that's one of the criticisms of the Pope, that the Pope never stood up against the Nazis, you know, like a little bit in Italy or the Roman Jews, but in general, the Pope never stood up and spoke against the Nazis.
Most of the churches did not. It's only individual efforts where
Yes.
a
Yes.
priest or a
Nuns and
prelate will really
priests,
put
correct.
their head in a noose to save the Jews. This happened in Greece, but these countries have
This
histories of
chauvinistic-
Nazi anti-Semitism.
Oh,
The Greeks and the
And Bulgaria being so poor country, honestly, they say everybody was equally poor.
So you
So
think
there
were-
wasn't
sorry.
any particular anti-Jews feelings in the country.
So there were
I-
never any rich Jews?
Well, it was also, well, that's a good question.
I don't
Everybody
think
was
in
poor.
that way, because this was a
Everybody was
poor
poor.
country after the Ottoman Empire left.
Yes.
It was like in a feudal state.
Oh.
Everything was very starting from scratch, and
But what about you can also think about it as a Slavic-German, clash, because the Slavs and the Germans
there
never-
is the
they were never-
cultural.
But,
yes.
on the other hand, in Yugoslavia and Greece and Romania,
Mhm.
and it didn't go this way at all. So,
I attribute that largely to the mentality of the Bulgarian people, and just when I first, which is, well, you're all stubborn. My first encounter with Balkan Slavs were Serbs, and I found that their rabid nationalism was very offensive. And I thought, oh, more Balkan Slavs when I met Bulgarians, and found you're not like your Serbian neighbors. And I said, hell no. and they never evinced the chauvinism of the Greeks either, which is even more.
I
More so.
believe through the 500th century Bulgaria, just the confidence in ourselves was very low, and it still is. We still wait somebody to come and save us. Like before was Russia, now Americans. You know what? They don't come to save us. How come? So it will take time to we actually think it's very low confidence. Okay, I'll give you an example. Me and my husband. He said, I should learn Bulgarian. I'm like, oh, why do you need to learn Bulgarian? I'm like, oh, why do you need Bulgarian? Come on, he knows Russian. It's like, it's good enough.
what's the population of Bulgaria now?
About 7 million people.
It was 8-9 million, but now
everybody's leaving. Everybody's
Everybody's
leaving.
What's it like for like the community of, a lot of places are, Judaism is kind of thriving, Israelis are sort of finding places and all over, and
Bulgarians
cemeteries
are not so actively
cleaned up.
religious in any state, even in the church. Okay,
They're not
we say-
religious people.
we're not so religious, and whether Jews or Bulgarian, and somehow, I don't know, going to church, it's a cultural place, not so religious. Synagogue was there.
The synagogue
But
is open.
Right now
Who's
it's
running the
open.
synagogue then?
Oh,
There
yeah,
is a head rabbi. There's a
Chabad?
chief
Is
rabbi.
it
I was going to say
Chabad in
Chabad as
Bulgaria?
well. Is it
Rabbi.
There
Chabad?
must be a Chabad
Yeah.
in Bulgaria.
Yeah,
And
but
they're trying to appeal to Michael community.
But I can assure you that I grew up in Bulgaria not knowing I'm a Jew. Like, okay, something maybe I heard, but it wasn't taught. And my friends would say, what do you mean? To be Jewish is high standard and high quality. You have to be proud. And I'm like, fine. I'm like everybody else. But for the first time, for my big surprise, I studied in Russia for 5 years in Soviet. And I was sent to Bukhara. It's one of the Uzbekistan.
Central Asian
and
republics.
It was actually a rabbi presenting paper, and he showed me, and he invited me, and I see a ghetto. That was the first time I saw what ghetto is. And I'm like, he said, oh, we are here surrounded. I'm like, and we only married among ourselves. I was, I think, the most shocked in my life, because his lecture was music of Bukharski Evrei, Jews. And I'm like, what do you mean? Like, why do you separate? So I realized in Bulgaria that never existed. There is Jewish neighborhood, but everybody
As I said,
lives there.
it was not a ghetto, it was a neighborhood.
A neighborhood, but
Just
still
a
the
neighbor-
Jews live together in a
They're
certain area.
sort
You
of-
showed us, right?
Yeah, sort of in that
Yeah.
area, and so, well, where was, I had to ask where it was, and of course, I've been through it many
I
times.
don't know
and
exact
But did they
building.
not practice, I mean, your family, the rituals
Well,
of,
but you
you
had
know,
the
Shiva,
synagogue.
when someone
Somebody must have
died, or
gone to the
Shabbat?
synagogue.
Nothing?
I introduced myself to Susanna like a very bad Jew.
No, okay.
I told her we'd fix her.
Yeah.
We'll make her a better Jew.
But both of my parents are Levi, independently. So I believe I've been in my previous life rabbi. I'm a teacher.
Yes, absolutely.
I'm absorbing this.
Absolutely.
But yes, I'm very proud to
No,
be
but
Bulgarian.
there's a lovely synagogue, you said. So
It's
who-
beautiful.
It's magnificent, yeah.
Yeah, who's using the synagogue?
It's
No,
open,
no,
but
it's
the Jewish,
functioning.
it is functioning, it is
For
functioning,
the
yes.
Jews who are left.
Yes.
Yes. During the communism was like a cultural place.
Okay.
I don't even know.
But it's not
what
far
is
from the Jewish, there's a big functioning Jewish community
Jewish
center.
cultural
And is there a
center. I play
cemetery?
concerts.
What
there.
about
Oh, yeah,
There is
Is
one
there a
central cemetery
Very
in
beautiful.
Sofia with a
Oh,
large
my
Jewish quarter, and
There is.
both Annie's
Yes.
parents are
Yeah,
are
they're
buried
They're
there.
there.
Yes, yes, we did use rabbi to come and bury it, everything, but it wasn't for religious service. It's like civil service. It's some sort of service we need. And yes,
Yeah,
so
you
we
chose-
follow what he
yeah.
told us.
Oh, she did tell you, so that's interesting.
Yes,
So
he
like
told
you were
us.
very traditional.
Yes.
You were carrying on a traditional, but
Without
not within
knowing.
a religion.
Without realizing it.
Yeah.
Yeah, not
Yeah,
within
it is.
a religious framework.
And usually my grandma would say certain things, and my mom and my dad both were scientists. Oh, mom, she would tell my grandma, oh, come on, don't stop nonsense. It's never been really part in my education, so upbringing. So he knows more about my tradition than I do.
A
Well,
reminder of a few things.
well, I was going to say now, thank you very much. We all know. That was very, very lovely. Do you want to speak a little bit about the Tehilim that's coming up?
Okay, being so proud of being Jew from Bulgaria, I did believe that we should celebrate and we should tell Vancouver population, being Jew or not, doesn't matter. Rudy may know, the composer I wanted to feature on 27th of May, this is just previous concert, is a piece called Tehilim by one of the most famous living composer, Jewish American, Steve Reich. The piece is written, it's called Tehilim, I understand means a psalm, with quotation from the Bible and from Old Testament.
It's actually it's 4 psalms. He says
Four songs. But it is written in a very modern, contemporary music style. And I'm kind of scared that maybe not everybody can understand, but to me it is the true, deep Jewish roots brought today to the world with modern means, and famous name composer. Tehilim, the piece itself, is performed by 23 musicians, so we're trying to find funding for all these people to be paid. We have application in Jewish Federation and Foundation, and so we are trying to work for, and this concert that I'm performing with three of my great colleagues from Vancouver Symphony, concertmaster and opera concertmaster, they're great, great musicians. We would like to offer you, do you have the music?
Or, well,
The prayer.
yes.
We are featuring on this fundraiser concert music that everybody loves. This is Tchaikovsky trio, Rudy knows. This is a piece that is gigantic, beautiful, Russian.
Can take one
And 3 more pieces by Jewish composer. One of them is Ernst Bloch, Jewish American, and our Canadian Glick, Srul Irving Glick, and Ravel, one of the greatest pieces for Jewish. So, concert is dedicated to Jewish culture, whether written by big masters like Tchaikovsky, because his trio is dedicated to his friend Nikolai Rubinstein, And we want to tell the Jews, I want to tell you, come and experience the real Jewish, what Jewish intellectual intelligence left through the history. This piece, when I listen, I want to cry. I'm going to let you listen. We will play it. Why don't you put it on?
I don't have a video, just have the audio.
I need to tell you that.
So what song is that?
Hmm?
That's a Yiddish song.
Yeah, the first one.
You said that the music reminds you of.
A Yiddish song, absolutely. What is
no,
it?
no,
It's the block.
yes,
Yeah,
yes.
Ernst Bloch.
Right, but what song is it? There's a Yiddish
You
song.
told me that this is the most famous.
Rudy, what's the Jewish song?
I know, I can't think.
But doesn't it remind you of a
Yeah,
Yiddish
it is.
song? Like, the words are like in my head, but I
It's not
can't.
the Kol Nidre, is it?
No, it's not Kol Nidre.
There's no song that I know.
Oh, yeah. Something with a mamala in it. It's a Yiddish song that I know.
It is based obviously on
Yeah.
Jewish folklore. I just wanted to tell you I'm on a verge to reach this successful bringing the great piano for the concert.
Savino Malkane.
Avinu Malkane,
Ah,
I wanted to say, yes,
He's
because
right.
you said,
I didn't hear
you
that.
said
Rudy is
last
right.
time,
It's
she
Avinu
said when I
Malkane.
play for them.
Yeah.
We will have Fazioli for the concert.
Thank you.
Yes, well, I want to thank you so much. It was so educational, so wonderful.